Delighted to say we're joined by broadcasting royalty on the phone line, Mr. Peter Collins of RTE. Peter, welcome on the Irish F1 show. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Kev. I've never received that particular intro before, but I'll take it because I've been around a while, all right.
Well, look, we're absolutely delighted to have you on board, Peter. It's a real pleasure, honestly. And I suppose the first thing we would ask is, like, when you think of Formula One, doesn't matter what it is. If someone mentions Formula One to Peter Collins, what does Peter Collins think of?
Well, the first thing I think of, obviously, Kev, is the 10 years that I spent covering Formula One for RTE, because it just throws up a myriad of great memories. And I remember distinctly thinking at the time, during that period, we were extremely fortunate to have an Irish-owned team in Formula One, in the Jordan Grand Prix team. I mean, that in itself was remarkable. And we genuinely, I want to say we, the likes of David Kennedy, who was my co-comment, Declan Quigley, our pit lane reporter, and our producer, Michael Carroll, I mean, we did appreciate that this, was possibly a one-off, that it may never happen again, certainly in our lifetimes, that we'd have a Formula One team from an Irish point of view in the sport, So we really appreciated it. And then, I suppose, I began to focus in on the high points for Jordan. Many of them, of course, came in the 1999 season, when they did so well, and Heinz-Harald Frentzen did so well, coming third in the World Championship. I mean, that was a remarkable achievement for what was essentially a privateer team, something that probably doesn't even exist in Formula One these days. And if I focus even further, I go to the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix, where Jordan scored his first ever win through Damon Hill, and Ralf Schumacher also finished on the podium that day. I mean, that was an absolutely remarkable day, because I remember the race started in torrential rain, and there was a 14-car pile-up on the first lap, and trying to call that and do so relatively successfully, and to see the Jordan cars make it through the carnage and line up on the grid once again. Well, it was a brilliant day, and luckily nobody was injured in the particular incident, but and they all had spare cars at the time, so we basically had a full grid going racing once again. And for George to come out on top on that particular day was absolutely fantastic. So they're the sort of memories it throws up for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I suppose in terms of our TV screens, and indeed maybe radio stations for those of a certain vintage, you don't need any introduction, and you will largely be associated, even though you're big into what do you call it, the soccer side of things in more recent times. But I think a lot of your association to many people is F1. But what many people don't realise is, there was quite some time spent in other sports, and indeed in music, prior to you getting involved in F1. So maybe talk us through that time.
Sure, there was. I mean, initially, I suppose I got my first national broadcasting break with Radio 2 FM as it is today. And initially as a standby presenter, and then I got a 10-minute time slot every fortnight, once a fortnight, from the Galway studios. I'm originally from Westport and Mayo, so it wasn't a big trek for me down to Galway, but that was a good break. And from that, then I got a bit of on-air exposure, and shortly afterwards got a couple of weekend shows on Radio 2, as I said, as it was. And I suppose I wasn't too long in that before I started dabbling in television through, various opportunities came my way, and I took them, a little bit of continuity here and there. And then I got a chance to audition for a sports program through the sports department. They asked me to audition for, it was an coverage of Aussie rules at the time. So that was my first, I suppose, program break. And then I moved to the newsroom as a sports reporter for 5 years. And I suppose that was from 1990 to 1995. A good time, I suppose, to be involved in sports coverage, because in many ways it was in its infancy on news. News wasn't renowned for giving sports serious coverage, but it had begun 2 or 3 years earlier with Irwin Jones and the late Colin Murray. They started covering sport, and then I became involved and did that for 5 years before I got my break in the sports department proper.
Yeah, and I suppose during that time we're talking about World Cups, we're talking about Olympics, and post-match interviews and different things like that. One of the most, I suppose, intimidating you may have come up across, I suppose, and you'll confirm that for us. It's not me putting words in your mouth. Mr. Jack Charlton, I'd say they were interesting exchanges.
Yeah, I had some very interesting exchanges with Jack, because I suppose one of my key roles during that time in the newsroom was the pre- and post-match interviews. And Jack at times could be could be challenging. I remember after the Mexico game, the defeat against Mexico at the 1994 World Cup in the United States, and I said to Jack after the match, I said, both Dennis Irwin and Terry Phelan, I said, I picked up second yellow cards. What are you going to do? And he kind of looked at me. His nostrils flared and his eyes widened, and he said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Pick two other bloody players. What do you think I'm going to do?" And he marched off into the distance. And I said, "Well, I suppose that answers the question." But I had a few exchanges like that with Jack. But overall, I mean, I really admired him as a manager, and he was probably the best storyteller I've ever come across in sport. But, cross him on a bad day, and you were in trouble, that's for sure.
Yeah. And they're probably, I suppose, I won't say sobering lessons, but definitely lessons you learn in time, that as a post-match reporter, that you kind of park that emotion and realize that what they're reacting to or the way they're reacting is not really your problem, because you're there to do the job and extract the information. And the earlier you can get to someone after a game or after a race, the likelihood is you'll probably get more, I suppose, raw content, because they haven't had time to maybe calm themselves down. And it sounds like you're taking, I suppose, or being an opportunist, but really that's the name of the game, and it's all a part of it too, isn't it?
It is really, Kev. It's difficult for both the reporter and indeed the person who's there answering the questions. And I have sympathy for both sides, because, and possibly even more so nowadays than then. Now sort of people are looking for sort of instant sort of reaction to everything, and I think some questions are hard to answer because managers or players or whatever the case may be, they really haven't had time to process exactly what has gone on. And yet there is an expectation of them, and indeed of the reporter, to give an accurate summation of what has gone on. And I think sometimes it's unfair. But having said that, part of what we do is entertainment. And I think for people at home, they want to hear from the manager, they want to hear from the players, and a lot of questions have to be asked.
Yep, simple as that. And if you don't ask them, you're not doing your job. So in terms of the F1 coverage then, so did RTE go looking for F1, or did F1 go looking for RTE?
RTE went looking for Formula One, and our then head of sports, Tim O'Connor, probably prompted by a guy called Michael O'Carroll. Michael was the guy who drove the motorsport coverage, and there was quite a lot of it on RTE at the time. I mean, we used to cover things like the Leinster Trophy meeting, we used to cover the Phoenix Park races, we used to cover the Circuit of Ireland rally, and all that was driven by a great man, Michael O'Carroll, who eventually became the Formula One producer. But I think he probably prompted Tim O'Connor and said, "Look, there's an Irish team in Formula One. We really should be across this. It's a blue ribbon event. Let's try and do a deal." And in fairness to Tim, he went and he did a very good deal with Bernie Ecclestone. And at that time as well, I realised that when I watched the Bernie Ecclestone documentary, which was released recently, called Lucky, it's a remarkable sort of history through Bernie's eyes of Formula One right from 1950 onwards. And he basically said in and around that time, he had decided to make a concerted effort to get Formula One onto all the major terrestrial broadcasters to increase its global profile. And so I suppose Tim went looking for that deal at an appropriate time. Bernie wanted to spread the Formula One word across the globe, and Ireland was another territory. It was another country. And as I always said to people, we may be a small country, but when you list off countries, we're exactly the same as everybody else. You say it's in France, it's in Germany, it's in Spain, it's in Ireland, it's in the United States, it's in Argentina, it's in Brazil. So I always felt we were every bit as significant as anybody else, except obviously carrying a slightly smaller audience,
Yeah, and Michael O'Carroll is held in such high esteem. Even to this day, you hear Plum Tyndall regularly speaking about the influence he had in the RPM programs too, which would be another thing. I know you mentioned the Circuit of Ireland, but the actual magazine type program, which has caused huge debate in rally circles actually in the past couple of years, whether streaming is the best route, whether TV programs are. My own opinion would be that they can both coexist, and it would be fantastic that we hit all platforms. But I suppose going back to you then, and getting involved in 1995. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you obviously had quite a draw for F1, and having, I suppose, taken that into consideration, was there still an element of surprise whenever you get, I suppose, the opportunity to go and front this?
Oh, on my part, total surprise. Now, I mean, I grew up loving Formula One because, like, my dad was involved in the car business, so I had a natural leaning towards cars and all things motorsport and indeed speed. So, so yeah, I mean, I can clearly remember, sort of following Mario Andretti for some reason. Don't ask me what reason it was. Maybe he's was the most exotic name, and possibly, around the time he was winning the World Championship that I really started developing an interest in Formula One. But it continued right through into my sports career. When I started in the newsroom as a sports reporter, there was a running joke in the newsroom, was it now to News of Sport, here's Peter Collins, and then they say jokingly, first to Formula One, which wasn't the case, obviously. Although when it came to a Grand Prix weekend, from 1991 onwards, when we had Jordan involved, it probably was the case. So Formula One is sort of superseded even GAA and football and racing and everything else. So yeah, maybe editorially it wasn't the correct decision, but I wanted to stay front and centre because I thought what Jordan were doing was quite remarkable,
Yeah. From your point of view then, so you're launched straight into anchoring the coverage for F1, but how many opportunities of any not sporting event, but motorsport event would you have got prior to this, like?
Well, not many really. I mean, we did the odd thing around Mondello, because I worked on a preview program on a Friday night, and I did some stuff for Sports Stadium. I also did stuff for news, in terms of feature reports on various drivers and things like that. But that, I suppose, would have been about it. And I had attended a couple of Grand Prix in a sort of working stroke guest capacity. So, and then I think Tim decided at the time, my broadcasting career was still in its infancy, so he decided, well, we're getting into this thing at the start. I want somebody fresh. I want somebody new. And while there were a couple of other candidates that would have been considered at the time, and you mentioned Plum Tyndall, obviously, who was a great broadcaster in terms of motorsport coverage here in Ireland, and Brian Chute as well would have also been in the frame. But I think Tim decided, I want somebody new, and he decided to give me a chance. But little did I realise that it really was only a chance, because our first Grand Prix was in Brazil. So we were packed off to Brazil. We had auditioned for a co-commentator, and David Kennedy got that job, and we were packed off to Brazil. We did the Brazilian Grand Prix, which was rain delayed at the start, but we had prepared ourselves to within an inch of our lives. I think the race could have been 24 hours long, and we would have had something to say, because we had every helmet and every driver's history and team history painted around our commentary box in Brazil. But we were back in Brazil anyway, and on my desk in the sports department were the tickets to go to Argentina. And I remember saying to Tim O'Connor, and I was like, well, surely, I mean, it would have made total sense for us to go from Brazil just on to Argentina, not this trek back and back out again. He said, oh yeah, he said, in the normal scheme of things, he said, that would have been the thing to do. He said, but had you made a mess of the Brazilian Grand Prix, he said, you were never going to do another. So basically, I was live auditioned, but I didn't know it, thankfully, at the time. And our tour for 10 years started from that point on.
Yeah, and it's mad just in that single moment, like in that, literally, that story, how things could have been so different. And if there's any lesson to be gotten that for any aspiring broadcaster or anyone in media, it's have your homework done. And Peter, you'd be surprised how many people would fail to do that. And I mean, when you consider what you're doing and the length of time you could have between one incident and another to fill, it is something that you could get cut out on very quickly. And I think people will know straight away. A lot of people will know if you're bluffing or not. So, I mean, it's mad. You think of things happening for a reason and stuff like that. Like, if that hadn't happened and you weren't prepared, that was probably the most standout thing from an editorial point of view that made them think, wow, look, well, this guy was prepared. He had his homework done. He was able to fill the gap. That can't have been easy. Yeah, this is the right guy. Like, that's just so important now in hindsight, isn't it?
Well, it's hugely important, and as you know, Kev, I mean, we're all Formula One fans here, but there are times where races can be very, very processional, and there aren't sort of overtaking manoeuvres taking place on every single lap that you can describe with great excitement and enthusiasm. I mean, that doesn't happen in Formula One all the time, even to this day. And I mean, they spend their time wondering how they can get the cars to race closer, but the plans don't always work. So you really have to have a lot of homework done, and it's not just about knowing about the drivers. It's not just knowing about the team owners. I mean, you have to sort of speak to engineers, and you have to get some sort of handle. I mean, we're not technical experts by any stretch of the imagination, because Formula One is so technical. But you have to have a handle on why certain cars are working, why improvements have been made from practice through qualifying through race day, and impart that information then to the viewer. And hugely important to do your homework. But I've always said, for a good race, you might only use 15% of your homework or your preparation. But on a bad race, you could use up to 75% of your preparation. So you have to have it done. There isn't really a choice. And it applies to, not just to Formula One, it applies to anything you're doing. The vast majority of your time in this business is spent preparing for your next broadcast. And the broadcast is relatively short, would say, compared to your normal working week. You might only be on air for, let's say, 3 hours for a match or 3 hours for a race. But, you probably spent, the bones of 3 full working days preparing for that broadcast. And that's kind of normal. And when it comes to the major championships, then, well, you spend months just getting your prep at various times, getting your prep together for Olympics and World Cups. It's an ongoing process. But I suppose if you love sport, it's not the hardest thing in the world to do, because you'd probably be looking up a lot of this stuff anyway,
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I'm so glad you've said that, because it's something that, it's not that I've had to explain it to people, but you kind of would like people to realize and appreciate that maybe the hour that you're on air for is the enjoyable part, the easy part, and then everything else is absolute hardship and chaos at times. But you mentioned, the homework in particular, like having that done. A lot of that is timeless then as well. So you'll use some, and you might actually be able to use some later on. So it's worth putting in that bit of additional graft that, we know from race to race things will change, but a certain amount of things won't. And, little facts and figures that you can throw out there. I think that's another little thing that people could maybe learn from listening to the conversation or whatever. But going back to 95 then, and Schumacher, right? I mean, I read the article with Boz.ie recently, and I'd love for you to share with our listeners that particular experience or exchange in late 1995 with Mr. Schumacher, where you could have been intimidated, but you stood your ground.
Yeah. I know the story you're now referring to, all right, yeah. That happened, it was in Aida, the Pacific Grand Prix, and I think it was going to be Michael's first opportunity to actually win the World Championship. So the night before, Benetton had arranged a press conference, and Michael O'Carroll said to me, "You get to that press conference room early and get a pole position," quite literally. So I got there nice and early, and I literally got the seat directly in front of where Michael would have been sitting for the press conference. And then gradually the world's media filed in. I don't know how many were in the room, possibly maybe 150 between cameramen and journalists. Obviously it was the story, so everybody turned up to hear what Michael had to say ahead of, it was the Saturday night, so ahead of the race on Sunday, what Michael was going to say. And just before he came in, the host there, Japanese television, came in and they said, "You've taken our spot." I said, "Well, I was here first," and I had to let on that we were live to Ireland, and I would only ask 3 or 4 questions, and then I would let them take the position. And luckily, they let me away with it. Anyway, the press conference started, and I opened with my first question, and he gave me a fantastic answer. I mean, he was always professional. So you always knew if you got to ask Michael Schumacher a question, he would give you a very professional answer. He didn't mess around. And then midway through my second question, I got a tap on my shoulder from the cameraman. And I turned around and he was shaking his head. I go, "What's wrong?" And he said, "My battery is gone." I turned around and Michael Schumacher was looking at me, none too pleased, and he said, "You call this professional?" And I said, "My sincere apologies, Michael." I said, "We have been filming all day." I said, "But we do hire our cameraman from RTL Germany, And he looked at me and he kind of went, "Right, I know what he's thinking. Is this becoming a point scoring exercise or what?" And he just put his finger in the air and he said, "Okay." He said, 1-1. So it wasn't RTE Ireland's fault, on this particular occasion. But in fairness, he was very gracious about it. Well, do you mind if I pick up on that second question again? And considering the sort of media obligations he had at that point, he was very professional about it, and his second answer was every bit as good as his first, And so, but it was mildly embarrassing for me for a moment in time. It was, I have to admit.
Yeah, and obviously, I suppose you did get the opportunity to speak with him a few more times after that. There's one in our turn of the millennium. I remember when he was in Ireland that you got to have a chat, and you mentioned the professional side, and we would have had Lee McKenzie on this show, obviously, previously, and she'd mentioned literally what you mentioned in terms of the professionalism and how much fun he was then kind of off camera or off mic, whatever way you want to put it. So what was he actually like? Did you get much experience or time away from that sort of a setting with him? And what would your impressions be on him, both on and off set, was that?
No, I mean, in fairness, when you're the world champion and acknowledged as the best, and the demands of these guys are immense. So eventually they decide what they do. And Michael sort of didn't do a huge amount of media when he was at the top of his game, because I suppose he saw it as an unnecessary distraction. We did have the odd occasion to speak with him, not necessarily on camera. And I remember we ended up in a karaoke hut at the Suzuka circuit at the end of one Grand Prix season. And he basically was sort of master of ceremonies in one of these karaoke huts that we ended up in. And I have to say, he wasn't the greatest singer, but he certainly knew how to enjoy himself once the season was over, So, I mean, there was a personal side to Michael Schumacher, but you didn't get to see it that often because he was quite private, away from the glare of the Formula One media. And I wouldn't say reclusive, but he had his own circle of friends, and that's kind of the way it was. And that's the way it had to be. He couldn't go around glad-handing everybody who wanted to speak to him, because there were just so many people involved, from a media point of view, from a sponsorship point of view. I mean, the demands made of these guys is immense. And probably more so these days. I mean, you see them having to do all sorts of interviews now, pre, post, or practice, qualifying, the race. And honestly, I don't know how the drivers in particular find the time in the day to do the amount of stuff they do, but I suppose it's part of their commercial obligation these days.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. The other interesting thing, it's on record, and I'll get you to confirm it here again. You went to literally all these races. It's not something that was done off tube, yeah?
Yeah, we went to every single race. Yeah,
that's amazing. That, number one, that there was resources to do that. Number two, you got the opportunity to do that. And then the last thing, and the most important thing I want to hear about, is obviously you build up the relationship with, whether it's Declan Quigley or with David Kennedy, and later on maybe Gary Anderson. I'm sure there's some pretty good stories that you may not be able to tell us about, but you might give us some little insight about the enjoyment that you would have had maybe away from work while being able to go on these trips. And we should point out as well, they're not trips for the crack. You are there and you are working, and it's serious and it is taxing on the body. But there is an opportunity to let the hair down as well, of course.
Oh, there certainly is, and I can tell you, Kev, I had a lot more hair then than I do have now. And I wasn't averse to letting it down. I can assure you of that. But in general, I mean, we were invited to a lot of things during that time in Formula One, but rarely did we attend anything on a Saturday night because it was too close to race day. And I mean, between all the travel and rigging equipment and watching practice, I mean, stuff starts at a circuit, as you probably know, early in the morning. You'd be there from 8 o'clock every morning, Thursday through to Sunday, from 8 maybe until 6, 7, 8 o'clock. So that was kind of a standard day. But there were occasions where you got an opportunity to go out. And I remember we were invited to dinner one night at Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo, and that sort of invitation you simply cannot turn down. And we attended, and what was really interesting was there literally were famous faces right around the restaurant in Hotel de Paris. There was, I remember seeing Mick Hucknall there from Simply Red, accompanied by a bevy of beauties, it has to be said. And Mick Jagger was there, as was Sylvester Stallone, and they were at the same table. And the reason Stallone was there, he was researching a movie that was supposed to be about Formula One. It eventually ended up being about IndyCar, and I don't know whether you've seen it. The most ridiculous motorsport movie you've ever seen, because at one stage the car ends up driving upside down. That's how ridiculous it is. Now, while it is possible for a Formula One car to drive upside down, there should be a nicely designed tunnel for it to achieve that particular feat. But anyway, he was, so you had these famous people all around. And while that was an enjoyable experience, fine, you're in that sort of company. But at the end of the evening, you finish up your dinner, you get your cab home, and you sort of start going through your notes for the race the following day. But we had some remarkable experiences at times where you'd have to sort of, particularly on the long haul journeys, because you have to wait for flights on the Monday. So very often you try and do something on the Monday, and we went down Whitewater Rapids on St. Lawrence River in Montreal. We went zip lining in Japan. We did. If there was a window of opportunity, in fairness, especially the likes of David Kennedy, he was always very proactive. Well, let's not waste this time. Let's make the best use of it possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's deadly, and I get the feeling it's tip of the iceberg stuff as well. But yeah, I appreciate there's some things that'll never be left out of the can, and rightly so. And
Kev, the rest will be in the book.
Great stuff. Yeah. Well, you can give us the exclusive on the book as well whenever that's coming out. But if it is to come out, that'll be a serious read, by the way. But anyway,
well, I've often considered it, but I think I'll wait until I hang up the microphone here in RTE.
Yeah, well, look, there's life in the old dog yet, as the fella said, right? But
there's a few years left.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you call it? It all stems from enjoyment, of course. Well, but like something that I picked up on there, you mentioned all the big names, right? And obviously now, as Conor Moore put it recently, a lot of these Formula One drivers are now not just Formula One drivers; they're TV stars because of Drive to Survive. And the point I would make is, so whether it's like I don't know, whether it's Max Verstappen now or whether it's like Sylvester Stallone years ago that you bumped into or whatever, there would be an assumption sometimes that you only come to realize, I think, a little bit later on in life that I don't know if there's that like holier than thou aspect or whatever way you want to put it, that maybe they're kind of above you, or maybe you feel an inferiority complex. Maybe that's just a mindset. But you do realize in time that these are just normal people, the same as kind of you and me or whatever. And if they are acting in a manner which is probably holier than thou, then maybe they're the asshole. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, possibly. Well, you see, in many ways, I mean, they are normal people doing extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And you were asking me about Michael Schumacher there a short time ago. I'm often asked the question, what distinguishes the greats, from everybody else? And what I found interviewing people from all walks of sport, as opposed to all walks of life, is that the best guys, even when they're doing an interview, you can actually see the focus in front of you, by listening to what they're saying, and an absolute focus and attention to detail. And it's quite remarkable. It's almost difficult to describe, but you do experience something different with the likes of Michael Schumacher, and it would have been the same, when you watch interviews, even with, we say, Senna and the Senna movie, you can see it in him as well. This desire to be the best, and nothing else matters. They have an ability to close pretty much everything else out of their lives when they're at their job in question. And it applies to the best across all sports, not just motorsport. Same in football, same in snooker, same in tennis. And you look at places like Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal and Novak Djokovic. I mean, to remain at the top at that level of sport for such a long period of time is absolutely remarkable. Because, I mean, any of us who've taken part in sports and various sports, and you realise what it takes just to become good at something. I mean, we all try to get good at golf or tennis or swimming or cycling or whatever it is. And you realise, you're only with the hating place beside, these superstars of world sports, and what it takes to achieve those levels is an absolute and total focus. I know I was off on a little bit of a tangent there, Kevin, didn't quite answer the question that you posed. But, because I suppose I've had the experience of speaking with a lot of these people, for any aspiring sports person, it has to be total and absolute focus if you're to reach the top.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree. And like, there is a certain aura about some of these people as well beforehand.
Yeah.
That you may find kind of intimidating as a broadcaster or something, or perhaps some would. But you just, as I say, you kind of figure out in time that while their sporting achievements are extraordinary, a lot of them are quite down to earth as well. Behind it all, and they just want to lead that normal life, don't they?
They do, and you can understand, because of the pressures of them, to, first of all, they've got to perform at their sport. And that has to be the priority. And then they have all these commitments, commercial commitments to major sponsors. I mean, sometimes, I know, sort of, if I was in the position of a lot of these guys, if I ever attained that level of success as a sports person, I couldn't have dealt with it. Genuinely couldn't have dealt with it, because it's painful, some of the things they have to do to please sponsors and hangers on and things like that. But again, the good guys manage to sort of compartmentalize that sort of thing as well and handle it. But it can't be easy. It cannot be easy.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the top of the interview, you mentioned the Jordan 1-2 and how successful a season 1999 was. And not too long ago, I actually sat down and watched a documentary about Jordan in 1998, and things weren't looking great up until Belgium. And it was quite remarkable. And even, I'd kind of forgotten what was going on with Ralf Schumacher at the time, with Williams kind of headhunting and all the contract obligations. And we didn't have the benefit of having access to team radios during those broadcasts. Maybe you did. Maybe you'll enlighten us on that. But it's certainly afterwards, only by watching these documentaries, you realise that Ralph, for a moment, looked like he wasn't going to obey those team orders. Now, I don't know if you have any knowledge of that kind of at the time, but it was just a magnificent thing and a bizarre thing at the same time, I'm sure, for you to be kind of telling the story on.
Yeah, no, it was really interesting. And we didn't have access to car radio or anything like that at the time. We had Declan was in the pit lane for us at the time, but again, the teams wouldn't divulge that sort of information that they were telling Ralph not to overtake Damon, and he
was quicker, Peter. That's the thing. Sorry to cut across you. I mean,
okay.
He was actually quicker for large portions of that, and Damon seemed to make the suggestion to the team rather than the team making it first. And I think that's where the pressure came on, if I'm right or wrong.
I don't know, to be very honest with you, Kev, whether it was pressure from Damon. I read subsequently that it was, but I don't know how true that was because Damon never sort of confirmed it one way or the other. Ralph was quicker, there was no question about that. But I think ultimately the order came from Eddie. You are not to overtake Damon. And I think that decision was made for a number of reasons. First of all, Damon was a former world champion. Damon was British. So therefore, the amount of column inches his success would generate for Jordan Grand Prix in Britain, where they would be sourcing most of their sponsorship, would be far more significant, or very significant. It would be still significant had Ralph gone on and won the race, But I think, Eddie was thinking, well, commercially, it's probably better if Damon wins it, and that Ralph will have further opportunities. He's a younger driver. He'll have opportunities down the road. And I think that possibly influenced the decision. But as I said, we weren't aware of that going on during the race. And we were on the edge of our seats anyway, hoping that they'd hang on because conditions were very treacherous at the Francorchamps on the day. And you did think as well also, if Ralph made an overtaking move on Damon and Damon decided to defend, there was always the possibility that they would take each other out of the race, and Eddie Jordan just couldn't countenance that. And I think that was possibly the reason that Eddie clung to after the race, when people got wind that Ralph did want to overtake and felt he could, and he was faster. I think that's the line that Eddie chose because he said, well, there was no way we were going to take a risk of our two guys clashing. And, I can understand that decision. There was so much at stake, so much money at stake as well, because points mean prizes in Formula One and lots of money.
Yeah, absolutely. So having commentated on that particular race and the way things unfolded, the most infamous probably accident and a Star Tour race, indeed, the gap in between, and how everything worked out in terms of, Jordan's favour. Is that the most exciting and the proudest race that you've maybe commentated on, best performance-wise as well? And obviously afterwards then, how difficult was it to maybe get a hold of people that are directly involved with Jordan? We know, obviously, the Irish connection, but because they'd won, did they recognise that fact? Was it still as easy or maybe as accessible to get access to them, consider what had happened?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, on that point, Kevin, Jordan was very much aware that, of his obligations to Ireland, and also he had a desire for his story and the team's story to be documented in Ireland. So the team, I have to say, were always extremely cooperative with RTE. We would never have any complaints on that front whatsoever. And after that Belgian Grand Prix win, the press officer did have Damon Hill for us, and did have Ralf Schumacher, did have Eddie Jordan. They knew that Irish TV were going to be there. I mean, BBC were there. I think they were covering it for the UK at the time. And there were lots of other German TV there. But I think we were second in line to get those guys. And there was never any doubt from our point of view, that we weren't going to get the principals on that particular day because it was such a momentous day, and everybody in the team knew it. They knew that we'd be around with our camera and our microphone. They knew that. But I think from a personal point of view, well, it's difficult to assess your own performance, But in fact, some journalists, I think it was in the Independent, mentioned the TV coverage on RT on that particular day and did a sort of small comparison to BBC at the time, and commented on how we got the calls right during that big incident. So I suppose it did receive some complimentary words in the media at the time, which was nice, I suppose, from a personal point of view. But I'm sure there were other races, Kev, when you're broadcasting, there's some things you come away from and you think, yeah, I think that went well. I think we got the calls right. And then other times you come away thinking, it didn't quite work out. And sometimes the quality of the event dictates your broadcast, and there's nothing you can do about it. If an event is poor, there's very little you can do to dress it up to make it more interesting. Obviously, when an event is exciting and there's a lot going on, well, you get into a nice rhythm and you get into a good flow, and it's probably a more successful broadcast. So, but sometimes it's hard to assess, and sometimes you do have to sit down after the fact and go through it and listen to it and think, oh, right, I know that. And very often, you're kind of surprised, oh yeah, it actually went better than I thought, because you'll always come away from a long broadcast thinking, well, maybe if I had a chance to do that again, I might do it a little differently. But I mean, you're always your own biggest critic, aren't you? I mean, that's the same in any business, if you're trying to do an assessment of how you're performing, you're more inclined to fall on the critical side, and you look to other people really to do the assessment for you.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, you do 100 things, you do 99 right, and you always remember the wrong thing. That's just who we are by nature. I'm laughing, Peter, because, the reason I kind of asked that question about the accessibility afterwards and memory of, muscle memory of being there when things aren't as prominent for Jordan, that it's great that you still kind of got that, because I went up to, just a quick side story, I went up to Croke Park in 2018. I'm from Carlow. We don't get to Croke Park that often. We played Laois in the Leinster semi-final, and obviously lost by a couple of points. And maybe way around on the Cusick stand side. And I just at the Carlow dressing room, and Turlock O'Brien obviously gone very well with him. And he kind of spotted me, and he actually came out and did the interview. And next thing I got a little tap on the shoulder from the Croke Park PR person saying that you're good selves were to get the first interview, and what do you call it, the exchange. Yeah, I didn't take too kindly to it. I was like, well, that's funny. I didn't see you up in Carrigan Shannon there in February, and I was getting pissed down on a Division 4 game.
Oh, yeah.
But you know the way these things work, and how things could change when there's success and different things. But I'm delighted to hear that that was the case, and I wouldn't expect anything less either from Eddie.
Eddie Jordan was fantastic, and I know he enjoyed the coverage as well, because Eddie's a bit rock and roll, and he didn't mind the profile and all that sort of stuff, but genuinely he was always a pleasure to deal with, and never really caused us any difficulty, because obviously as the Irish broadcaster there, we wanted the Irish story, and that was our obligation to deliver that story to the Irish public.
Mm-hmm. Peter, you've been excellent with your time, and promised I won't take up too much more of it, and sorry about the technical difficulties that we may have had in getting set up as well, but a couple of little things before we finish up. So we have a couple of messages in from our listeners, which I'll get to in a moment's time, but I won't say left-wing questions, but questions that maybe wouldn't come up ordinarily. The team tune music, Firestarter and Right Here, Right Now. I mean, they're iconic tunes. They're iconic of its time and still iconic to this day. And a lot of people would associate that with the F1 coverage in RT as well. And to be honest with you, you'd still get goosebumps over that. I mean, it was such a great choice of music that really encapsulated what the sport was about in terms of energy and everything. When you hear those songs, does it remind you of that time as well?
Yeah, it does. I think the Formula 1 programs are going to begin every time I hear that. And we're going on air, well, not really, but yeah, I mean, obviously, that music is the other great passion in my life, along with sport. So luckily I was able to influence the choice of music for our Formula 1 coverage, and they are two particularly good tunes. They were very contemporary at the time, and sometimes contemporary music doesn't stand the test of time, because a lot of music dates as we move into different eras and different genres take over. But I think both those tunes kind of stand up even today. I mean, if they're played today on the radio, they wouldn't be out of place with anything else that's happening,
So, as we said, we're kind of going into quickfire mode here now with these questions, but frostiness with drivers or maybe teams down through the years, did you experience much of that? And in terms of friendships or relationships that you build up with drivers, teams, or broadcasters, have they stood the test of time?
With a couple of broadcasters, yes. Obviously, you're on the road together for that period of time, and you're going to strike up friendships and relationships along the way. And I remember in particular, the Dutch broadcasters were particularly helpful to us because we had an enormous amount of gear traveling at that particular time. And when you're hawking this gear around from airport to airport and hotel to hotel, it's pretty arduous at times. And our friends from, I think they were RTL, the Netherlands, when we were in Europe, they used to take that gear for us on their OB truck. And they offered, we didn't actually request it, so I thought, well, that's pretty decent. So I've always had a great time for the Dutch drivers because they saved our backs an awful lot during that time. And also when it came to rigging our equipment, their technician, Patrick, coincidentally, he has an Irish Christian name, but Patrick was always very helpful because you always encounter technical difficulties with transmission and reception for pit lane stuff and that. So yeah, we had, and also we got on extremely well with our British counterparts. And on many race days, I remember Murray Walker and myself used to have a brief chat, and he used to probe me as to what was happening in the Jordan team because he felt we had a little bit of an inside line because of the Irish connection. And very often I would get a couple of nuggets from Murray, and he was an absolute gentleman because here was a legend of broadcasting. He was as big as any sort of driver around the paddock, Murray Walker was. And I used to always be extremely complimented by the fact that Murray would come and ask me about Jordan, and we'd have a little chat just before the race broadcast, and then we'd go into our respective booths and off we went. In terms of drivers, not really. I got to know Ralph Furman, who drove for Jordan. I got to know him particularly well because we knew him kind of before he got the drive, and so we were delighted for him that happened. And he did have an Irish passport, which was pleasing from our point of view. His tenure at Jordan didn't last that long, but Ralph was a very nice fella, a gentleman really. And Rubens Barrichello as well, of the Brazilian drivers, got to know Rubens extremely well. Giancarlo Fisichella, I always felt he was one of the most talented drivers Jordan ever had behind the wheel. And, we got to know Giancarlo pretty well as well. And we had a kind of difficult relationship with Eddie Irvine. And I really don't know why, because, he started his career, his Formula One career with Jordan and moved on then to Ferrari and Jaguar and all that. But sometimes, while Eddie Jordan had always made himself available, the same couldn't be said of Eddie Irvine. Eddie at times could be a tricky customer when it came to dealing with the media. And we were never quite sure why that was. We thought that possibly because we were from the island of Ireland, that we'd be sort of, somebody that he might, or, a broadcaster he might graduate to. But he didn't. And that was just a matter of fact,
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. Seemed to live a lavish lifestyle afterwards as well, and I don't think he's doing too bad by the sounds of things. So yeah, interesting character for sure, Peter. So like in terms of where we're at now with F1, you obviously have the finger on the pulse. Obviously with work, maybe you get caught, and but would you sit down maybe if you can't get to see it live and sit down and watch the whole race afterwards?
Yeah, it is fortunate that Channel 4 don't cover every race, but they do carry highlights, and if I missed on today, which can be the case because I'm committed to stuff we're doing ourselves here, I'll always sit down and watch it, and if not in its entirety, I'll watch the highlights form. But I like to keep a close eye on it because like my daughter runs a Formula One website as well. And generated through her own interest. I don't think really it was inspired by my involvement in it. Just in more recent years, she got heavily into it and set up the Straight to the Grid website, which is still going. So I give her a hand out on that as well. So I like to keep a close eye on what's going on. I'm not too sure, Kevin, how competitive this season is going to be the way it starts off, but you do hope that maybe Aston Martin will become the main challenger to Red Bull, who started the season so strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm delighted you actually mentioned the website too. I thought you were going to forget for a second. I was going to say make sure you get that plug in. Good stuff, and that's remarkable to hear as well that the interest has come off Roanback kind of, and nice commonality to have as well in the household, no doubt. So the listeners' questions then. So first one up comes from Aidan Delaney. Hey, Irish F1 show. Grew up watching F1 with Peter Collins. Definitely one of the most underrated commentators out there. My question is, when RT lost rights to F1, did you get any offers to do it on another TV broadcaster, etc., etc.? Did Setanta Sports offer you a chance? So the first thing I'll actually add in there, did RT actually lose the rights or choose not to uptake the rights? And then you obviously went to MotoGP afterwards. And so I'll just put in those two things there in line with Aidan's question.
Yeah, well, very kind of Aidan to say that. I appreciate that comment, but I think what happened at the time, it was a case that Setanta they wanted a blue ribband product to kick off their station. They couldn't get the Premier League, so they went for Formula One, and I think it was a case. Yeah, they outbid RTE, and that was all fair in love and war. That's just the way it was. And but at that time, I mean, I felt from RTE's point of view that maybe the interest was waning a little bit, and that they may not have been as enthusiastic as previous seasons. But they did bid, so that probably blows that theory out the water. They did bid for it, but were outbid by Setanta. And yes, Setanta then did come to me and ask me would I front the coverage and would I take over the production for them. But once I realised RTE was losing Formula One, I had also developed a keen interest in MotoGP, and I'd been to a number of motorcycle Grand Prix, and I thought this product's amazing. It's every bit as exciting, every bit as good as F1 as far as I was concerned. And so I led RTE down the road of for a MotoGP deal. And so by the time Setanta came to me, we had committed to MotoGP for 3 years at that particular point. And, I was excited by, that new product, definitely excited by the racing and the characters involved, the likes of, Valentino Rossi and Loris Capirossi and people like that, really interesting, great sportsmen, hugely skilled at what they do. And I thought, well, and the travel as well wasn't going to be as punishing as the Formula One travel. So when I added everything up, really, I thought, right, I've done 10 years in Formula One. Could I do another 10 years? I thought, probably not, because it was extremely taxing, the travel and that level of commitment. And I thought something fresh like MotoGP would be just what the doctor ordered. So as opposed to heading off to Setanta and the big money, I decided to stick with RTE and go the MotoGP route, because it was also going to allow me to continue cover football, which is equally a passion of mine as well,
Mm-hmm. The second question there was, did the paddock atmosphere differ much in the MotoGP side of things in comparison to the F1?
Yes, it did. The access to the principals involved, the riders, was far easier, I would say, than it was in Formula One. The MotoGP riders, I suppose they weren't as precious, and maybe because the demands of them aren't as great, but they're almost as great. I mean, the traveling circus with MotoGP is probably just as big as Formula One, and the race attendances are in some cases will be even greater, particularly in the countries that absolutely live for it. I mean, Spain absolutely idolizes everything MotoGP and Grand Prix bike racing. Italy possibly to a lesser extent, but it's big in France as well. It's very big in Germany. And those races would have massive attendances. At the end of season race in Valencia over the weekend would have in the region of 400, 500,000 people coming through the turnstiles at those circuits. So but the paddock, probably I would say the paddock in MotoGP was more enjoyable to work in. The pressures didn't seem as great, because access was a little bit easier with the riders. You got to the stories a little bit easier. And there were some, Irish guys involved on the technical side of things as well. So we had good access to information and to garages. So you got in there on the bikes, and you got in to talk to mechanics and tire people. So, probably all in all, from a working point of view, it was probably a little bit more enjoyable in the end than Formula One, because the pressure in Formula One to get the story was massive, and access was difficult. And also the racing, in bike racing generally anyway, is a whole lot closer than car racing, because you don't have the huge aerodynamics involved. So the bikes are always running very close, and there's lots of overtaking. And it's a product that I would always promote from a racing point of view. Great to watch, great characters involved, and thoroughly enjoyed our time in MotoGP.
Good stuff. Very last question. This comes from me, not from a listener. Rally Ireland. We obviously present the Irish Rally podcast as well. You did the final stage. I think it was Rally Ireland 09. How much fun was that, and how cool was it for Ireland to have a WRC round?
Well, that was a particularly busy time for me, because not only was I trying to do commentary on the stages and all that, but also I was the program editor. So
oh wow, I didn't realise that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. It was very, very demanding. I remember at the time, when we finished that particular week, being absolutely exhausted, because it was like morning till dusk, and onwards. And I think if my memory serves me correctly, we were producing 2, possibly 3 programs a day on the World Rally. And because we were the host broadcaster, there was a huge amount to do. But in fairness, everybody involved in it worked extremely hard. And again, the drivers in particular, when it came to access, were extremely patient and extremely cooperative, because you needed their input to really sort of flesh out your programs and make it worthwhile for the viewers to tune in. Because there were, as you know, some significant drivers involved at the time, like Loeb, the world champion, and to get access to those guys was fantastic. So it was hard work for the time it was here, but again, it was another really enjoyable and a very different experience. Because as you know, the way rally operates is very, very different from circuit racing. But again, we had a good time doing it, and it's just a pity to have something back since.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, here's hoping. There is talks of Northern Ireland maybe hosting something, and there has been for some time. It didn't work out last year, but who knows what might happen in future. Peter, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the Irish F1 show. And you know what? I don't know if we're ever going to see the like of it again. I don't think we will. We possibly may never see F1 on RTE again. Hopefully we will, but I would say it's probably unlikely, and I know you're not here to speculate on that. But regardless of all of that, all I can do is say thanks for being the voice of many people's childhoods in terms of F1. You continue to be the voice of sport on RTE, and we are so delighted to say that we're after having you here on the Irish F1 show. So thanks a million for coming on with us, all right?
Not at all, Kevin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it was an enjoyable experience for me to go down memory lane. I don't do it too often, to be honest, because we're always looking towards the next event. But no, I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm glad that you guys enjoyed our time in F1 as well as much as we did.